Most people see Apple as an unbeatable god. They forget they were one signature away from disappearing forever. What was that signature? Who held the pen? And why do some of Apple's most hardcore purists still look back at this moment and call it a betrayal? To understand how close we came to a world without the iPhone, you have to forget the Apple of today. Forget the sleek glass stores. Forget the trillion-dollar valuations. Rewind to 1996. Apple isn't a titan. Apple is a sinking ship, and the water is rising fast. The company was a complete disaster zone. They had a product line so confusing that even their own sales reps couldn't explain it. They were selling dozens of different Macintosh computers with random names. Quadras, Centris, Performas. They were throwing millions of dollars at weird experiments. The Newton tablet, the Pippin video game console. But worst of all, their core software was dying. Apple's operating system was outdated, crashing constantly, and their secret project to replace it had just collapsed. Customers were jumping ship. Between 1996 and 1997, Apple lost over $1 billion. Let that sink in. $1 billion vanished. Their market share was in free fall. Wall Street was writing their obituary. The CEO at the time, a guy named Gil Amelio, was desperate. He needed a new operating system immediately, or the Macintosh was dead. So he looked around the industry and found a small, struggling software company called Next. Amelio bought it for $429 million. He got the software he needed, but he also accidentally brought a Trojan horse through the front gates of Apple. Because the guy who owned Next was Steve Jobs. The same Steve Jobs who had been fired from Apple a decade earlier. Jobs came back as an advisor. But Steve Jobs doesn't do advising. Within months, Jobs orchestrated a boardroom coup. Amelio was out. Jobs was in. He was finally back in control of his baby. There was just one massive problem. Jobs looked at the financial books and realized a terrifying truth. Apple was exactly 90 days away from bankruptcy. 90 days until the lights turned off. Jobs started slashing everything. He killed the Newton. He killed the confusing Mac lines. He fired the board of directors. But cutting costs wasn't enough. You can't shrink your way to greatness. Apple needed cash. They needed a lifeline. And more than anything, they needed a signal to the world that the Macintosh platform had a future. Jobs knew he had to ask for help. But he couldn't ask a bank. He couldn't ask a friend. He had to ask the enemy. August 1997. The Macworld Expo in Boston. This was the mecca for hardcore Apple fans. Thousands of loyalists packed into the auditorium. Jobs walked onto the stage. The crowd cheered. The prodigal son had returned. He talked about the future. He talked about rebuilding. And then the tone shifted. Jobs started talking about partnerships. He said Apple needed to let go of the idea that for them to win, someone else had to lose. The crowd went silent. They knew exactly who he was talking about. Suddenly, a face appeared on the giant projector screen looming over the stage. A giant, grinning, slightly nerdy face. Bill Gates. The auditorium erupted. But they weren't cheering. They were booing. Loud, visceral, angry boos. To understand this reaction, you have to understand the holy war of the 1990s. To Apple fans, Microsoft wasn't just a competitor. Microsoft was the evil empire. They believed Microsoft stole the graphical interface from a Mac to build Windows. They believed Microsoft built inferior, clunky products that somehow conquered the world. Apple was the Rebel Alliance. Microsoft was the Death Star. And here was Steve Jobs standing under a massive Orwellian projection of Bill Gates announcing a truce. To the purists in the room, this wasn't a partnership. This was a surrender. This was the ultimate betrayal. But Jobs wasn't playing to the crowd. He was playing for survival. He quieted the boos and explained the deal. Microsoft was investing $150 million into Apple stock. But the money was just the appetizer. The real prize was software. At the time, businesses and schools were abandoning the Mac because they needed Microsoft Office, Word, Excel, PowerPoint. If Microsoft stopped making Office for the Mac, the Apple ecosystem would instantly collapse. In this deal, Bill Gates committed to developing Microsoft Office for the Mac for the next 5 years. In exchange, Apple agreed to make Internet Explorer the default browser on the Mac, and they settled all the bitter lawsuits over stolen software designs. It was a masterstroke. Jobs traded a piece of Apple's pride for a guarantee of survival. And Bill Gates? He got to look like a statesman, helping out a struggling rival, right when the government was investigating Microsoft for being a ruthless monopoly. The booze eventually stopped. The deal went through, and $150 million bought Apple exactly what it needed: time. With the threat of instant bankruptcy gone, Jobs had the breathing room to do what he did best. A year later, he released the colorful iMac. It was a smash hit. Then came Mac OS X, then the iPod, then iTunes, then the iPhone. But none of it happens without that signature in 1997. What if Jobs' ego was too big? What if he refused to call Gates? By Christmas of 1997, Apple's bank accounts would have hit zero. The company would have likely been chopped up and sold for parts to IBM or Sun Microsystems. The Macintosh would be a forgotten relic. The smartphone revolution would have been delayed by a decade. The world you live in today, the screen you're looking at right now, would be completely different. The purists called it a betrayal, but history calls it the greatest pivot in business history. Because sometimes, to save everything you love, you have to shake hands with the devil.